Now, there may come a time when you need to remove or rebuild a server in your Proxmox VE cluster. In my case, the boot drive on one server needs to be replaced, and so the server is going to have to be rebuilt. But you can't remove a server from the cluster via the GUI. Instead, you have to use the command line. So, how do you remove a server from the cluster? And for that matter, how do you add a rebuilt server back in? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over.
Danger, Will Robinson, danger. Danger, Will Robinson, danger.
Removing a server from a cluster is a one-way trip, and it may not be easy to recover the cluster back to its previous state should things go wrong. And while the process should be trouble-free, you have to be prepared for a potential outage, in which case, make sure you have a backup of everything to hand. You need to be fully aware of what needs to be done ahead of time and have a process in place long before you touch your own system. Don't simply follow along and make changes as you watch this video or read my blog, because your circumstances may be different. Watch the video and/or read the blog first and then plan what you need to do. Ideally, test any changes in a lab first before making changes to a production environment. Now, if all you're going to be doing is to remove a server from the cluster, then feel free to skip ahead, because what I need to do is to actually rebuild a server. So what I've got in this cluster are two servers that are capable of running virtual machines, but there is actually a Q device involved as well. So you don't see that within the GUI, but I do actually have 3 voting machines within this cluster. Now what I need to do is to replace the boot drive on server 1 here. Now there are different ways to do that, but if you go through the documentation, the recommendation is to do a clean install. And for me, it actually makes more sense anyway. I mean, the actual server, it's kind of running off an NVMe drive similar to this. So it's an NVMe drive in a PCIe adapter in a PCIe slot, and I need to free the slot up. So the plan is to put in a DVD drive, except I'm going to have to be a bit creative because it's a Dell R620. So that drive is actually going to go into a DVD tray that's an adapter for SSD drives, and it means that the actual computer can actually boot off that SSD instead, and that gives me my free slot. Now is the actual opportunity to upgrade server 2 first. The reason being is that server 1's actually up and running, and what I can do is migrate my virtual machines over to server 1 without causing any interruption. The reason I want to do that is because we're going to be taking server 1 out, doing a complete fresh install of the operating system, then added back into the cluster, and it's best if they're both running the same version of the software. Easiest way to do that is to have them both running the latest version. So, like I said, now is the ideal time really to upgrade server number 2 to the latest version. Now, before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on HA here. I'm going to double check here that there's no actual jobs running, because the last thing I want is to migrate this virtual machine over to server 1, only for HA to then move it all the way back again. Now, as you can see, I'm not actually doing that, but it's definitely still worth checking. So then what I can do is now just migrate this server across to server 1. And then once that's completed, what it means is that this server is then free to be upgraded without causing any issues to any of our virtual machines. So we just need to wait for that. It shouldn't take too long. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to check this actual virtual machine here, because I'm actually running a ping test between the two of them. So we should start to see responses coming back. So that's still working, so that's fine. Now, what I'm going to be doing is a minor upgrade of the actual operating system. So it's pretty simple. I mean, we'll just go click on the actual server, go to updates, then we'll click on refresh. So we'll just wait for it to update the actual package lists here. And then once that task's actually completed, we can actually upgrade the operating system. Now, when it comes to Linux, you can typically upgrade it without needing a reboot, but in this particular case, I'm going to reboot it anyway, just for good measure. It's usually recommended if like the kernel gets updated, but in this case, as I say, I'm just going to play it safe anyway. So to do that, we'll just click on upgrade, wait for the console, and then we'll get an option to say yes or no. So in my case, I'm just going to select yes, so I can just either type in yes or just hit return, because yes is the default option. So off it's going to go upgrade this actual server, and then what I've just got to then do is reboot this server once that's all completed, and then we're ready to go. Now, before you remove a server from the cluster, it's best to check that the actual server isn't in use, but also that the cluster can support the removal. So I've got two servers here, and my plan is to remove server 1. So obviously I've got some virtual machines and templates, and I'm going to have to move those over to server 2. But before I do that, I'm going to run some pre-checks. Now, this is just a small cluster. It's not big enough to support Ceph, but that's something to factor in. I certainly don't want to be trying to remove an actual node if Ceph relies on that actual server. We've then got backup jobs. There's no point having backup jobs referencing a server if we're going to remove that server anyway. So it makes more sense to remove those actual jobs now. Then we've got replication jobs, which are actually more important to check. Reason being is that, let's say I've got a job running here and it relies on server number 1. According to the documentation, if I remove server 1 from the cluster, I could then be stuck with a job I cannot then delete. So it's best to take care of those jobs, either modify them or just simply delete them basically before you even remove the server from the cluster. And then we've got high availability, so you'll have high availability groups plus the high availability jobs. Again, you really don't want those referencing server 1. And I don't want to be stuck in a bit of a loop where I've got, say, like a virtual machine where HA prefers it to be on server 1. I migrated over to server 2, and then HA basically migrates it back again. So we'd be stuck in a bit of a wrestling match there. So it's best to take care of your HA rules now before you even actually move those virtual machines. Now, there is one last check I want to make, and I'm going to open up a shell session to do this, because if you look here, we've got 2 servers according to this GUI here. I'm just going to clear this out, and I'm going to run a command to get a bit more information about the cluster, because I want to make sure that this cluster is ready. Now, if you look down here where it's on about the voting information, you can see that we can get up to 3 votes, and we need at least 2 votes to achieve quorum. I've only got 2 servers, but the reason I can do that is because I've got a queue device. So I've got 3 voting machines basically here. The reason this is important is because if you want to make any changes, the way this is configured at the moment, you need at least 2 voting devices. If I only had 2 actual voting devices and I actually tried to remove server 1, fortunately, from what I found, it will actually stop you. If it didn't, we would then drop to only 1 server. We then wouldn't be able to achieve quorum afterwards, and I'd be stuck where I couldn't actually manage the cluster. At least not by default. There are ways around it. You can modify the configuration, but that's something you need to factor in. So for me, I should be fine. I mean, I can take this server out. I'll still be left with a server and a queue device. I'll still have 2 voting machines, which is enough to achieve quorum. So what we're going to do then is to migrate everything on this actual server over to this server. So I'm just going to select server 1. I'm going to then click on bulk actions, click on bulk migrate. By default, it picks everything that's on this machine, which is exactly what I want. I want to move everything across. It's automatically picking out server 2. It's the only one left. So I'm just going to click on migrate. And then off it will go. It's actually going to go through them one at a time, but it's going to move all of these actual virtual machines plus templates over to this server. So I've just got to basically wait until it's actually completed that. Now, one thing I'm going to point out is that obviously when I take this server out of the cluster, I'm going to be left with only 1 server. So there's going to be a window of opportunity, shall we say, where this server then goes offline. I've got to be prepared for that, and I am, because if this server goes down, that's it. The cluster's gone. All of these virtual machines will no longer be working. Worst case scenario for me is I'll have to probably rebuild this server, for instance, bring it back, and then recover everything from maybe backups, for instance. That's probably the worst case scenario. In other words, I'll still have this server operational. So we're just going to wait for these to finish, and then once they're done, I'm just going to do one final check, because I'm actually running an actual test between these two servers just to make sure that everything is still operational. So it looks like it's finished. It's moved the actual templates across as well. So I'm just going to go over to here, just check the console session. You should see a ping session running between this virtual machine and this one. So yeah, that's still actually running, so everything seems fine. You can see it's been running for a long time actually, but now that that's done, what I can do is I can actually shut down the server. So I'm going to go over to server 2, because basically I'm going to be controlling everything from server 2 going forwards. Just make sure I've got the right server. Then I'm going to click on shutdown. Tell it to shut down server number 1. The reason being is there isn't actually an option within the GUI to actually remove a server cleanly. We're going to have to do this all through the actual command line, and server number 1 isn't even going to be aware of this. That's just the way it works. Because of that, we don't want to be in a situation where once we delete server 1 from the cluster, server 1 comes back online, or at least it has no way to actually communicate with anything else within this cluster. If it does, there is the potential it could break the cluster, and you certainly don't want to do that. Now in my case, it's pretty straightforward, because I'm actually going to remove the boot drive. I'm going to completely replace it. I'm going to reinstall the operating system. So that's not something I need to worry about. But that is what I need to do before I go anywhere further, before I actually even try to delete this actual node from the cluster. I just want to make sure that this thing cannot come back online. Once I've done that, then we can start removing the actual server. Now, although I provided a warning at the start of this video, I do want to re-emphasize that we're going to be taking a big risk here when we remove this server from the cluster. Because once it's gone, that's it, we'll have crossed a point of no return. At this moment in time, we haven't actually changed anything within the cluster as such. There's still 2 servers, although granted one of them's turned off and the hard drive's detached. But I could reattach the drive, power up server 1, and I'll still have 2 operational servers. But when I actually remove server 1 from the cluster, then we've got a new cluster. I'll have server 2 and the Q device in that new cluster. It has changed, and there's just no going back from that. If I want to put server 1 back into the cluster, I'm going to have to rebuild it, which I do plan to do, and then add it back into the cluster as a new server. You need to be fully prepared. You need everything to be backed up, and basically you want to be in a situation where, should the unthinkable happen, you could rebuild all this from scratch. Now, for that reason, I would strongly suggest that you do all this in a lab first. It's very easy to set up a lab for hypervisors like this. All you need is a computer with enough CPU cores, enough memory. You install a hypervisor on that, then you set up virtual machines as nested virtual hypervisors, and off you go. You could replicate the actual production network. You could test everything out, and then go through that exact same process in the live network, and things should go exactly according to plan. So you should never just test something like this within a live production network. Test it in a lab first. In any case, now that this server's offline and it's not going to come back online, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove it from the cluster. So I could connect into server 2 using SSH, or I could go in through a shell session, and there's going to be a shell session we use, because there's no way of doing this through the actual GUI. So I'm just going to clear the actual command line here. I'm just going to run one final check. I mean, it's telling us that server 1's offline there, but I'm just running this command, PVE-CM nodes, and it'll tell us what's operational. So I can see that server 2 is up and running, and so is the Q device. So I'm okay to proceed. I've got 2 voting machines here. So I'm then going to run a command to actually remove server 1 from the cluster. So it's PVE-CM del node PVE demo 1. Double check, triple check, quadruple check, whatever, however many checks it takes, that is the proper host name of the server you want to remove from the cluster. Once I hit return, I won't be asked to confirm. So you've got to be prepared to have the proper host name here. Mine happens to be called PVE Demo 1. You'll have to put in whatever it is, the name of the server you want to remove. But bear in mind, it's not going to warn me. It's not going to ask me, are you sure you want to do this? The minute I hit return, that is it. So I'm going to hit return and that's it. It's gone. Now, I do get what they'll call a cosmetic error. So apparently this is basically because it can't actually talk to server 1. We're telling the cluster to remove server 1. It can't talk to server 1, so it's giving us an actual error about it. So we can safely ignore that. But what we're going to do is, well, I'm just going to clear the command line again. We're then going to run another command. So pvecm, then status. So what's now changed is, you'll see that the highest number of votes we can get now is 2. We still need at least 2 to achieve quorum, which we can. So now this cluster though is made up of server 2 plus the Q device. Now, one thing I'm going to point out, I'm just going to run this command here because the configuration for server 1 is actually still intact. So if you want, you can actually take a copy of all of these files because they get replicated between the servers. So these are all the files that relate to server 1. So if you want, you can back all this up if you want to bring this server back that way. I'm just going to start from scratch, so I'm not really concerned. But in any case, I'm actually then going to delete that folder. I'll just clear the command line so you can see the command a bit clearer. So I'm just going to remove the entire folder and I'm going to force it. So I want it a recursive removal. So I'm just going to remove that entire folder. So now it's gone. I don't need those. I'm just going to start completely from scratch with a fresh install anyway. So that's now gone. And part of the reason for doing that is because I'm going to be bringing back the exact same server. I mean, there's no real point me retaining that information with the cluster with the server gone. So like the documentation shows you, you should really remove that. But I'm now going to do some tidy up jobs here. One of the things I'm going to do, I'm just going to run another command, which is to use nano to edit this known hosts file, which belongs to server number 2. The reason being is this knows about server number 1. Now, in my case, I'm going to be rebuilding server number 1. It's going to come back with the same IP address, the same name, but it's going to have a different SSH fingerprint. So for that reason, I actually want to remove this line. So I'm just going to basically highlight both of these 2 lines for server 1. Control K, save the file, because otherwise it tends to complain that you've got a server with a different fingerprint. It doesn't know it's the same MAC address, same IP address, same host name. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, the fingerprint's changed. So that's just really to get rid of that potential warning. Now, incidentally, I've been making changes in the /etc/pve folder, which means I only have to do those changes on one server. So if it had more than one server in this cluster, say this had been like a 5 server cluster, for instance, I'd only have to make those changes on one server and they get replicated to the other ones. That's actually quite useful. Now, there is one final cleanup I want to do. If I go to data center and if I go to HA, you'll see there are actually references to servers that I actually had before. So although we've actually removed server 1 from this cluster, it's still being referenced. There's even still a server 3 that I removed some time ago. So what I'm going to do is just a bit of a cleanup job here. So just clear this out. Now, to do that on each server that you've got that's actually still operational, you want to run systemctl stop pde-ha-crm and then .service. So we'll just hit return and we'll just wait for it to stop that service. And you want to repeat that on every single server that's still running within the cluster. Once you've done that, then on one server, just clear this again actually, we actually delete a file. So we just run the remove command -F to force it. So removing this file, manager_status in /etc/pde/ha. We just do this once on this one server and it'll get replicated to the rest. And then what we'll do is we'll start up the service on this server where we've removed that file. Just wait for the service to start. And then you can go around the other servers and start it on them. If I go back to HA, all that information's now been lost. Now I don't actually have any HA jobs running anyway, so it doesn't really matter that the status is missing a bit of information. Once you start adding in jobs, it'll quickly go around and it'll start checking and it'll create that new file I found, so that's quite useful. But otherwise you've got this cosmetic error where it's referencing servers that basically just don't exist anymore. Now, that's pretty much it as far as actually deleting the server. Now, what you'll notice is it's still referencing this server up here. So if I hit refresh, that's it. Even the GUI is now updated. So server 1 has now been removed from the actual cluster. The only thing is it still knows about the old cluster. So again, as a reminder, you do not want server 1 now coming back up again, or whatever server it is that you actually removed. So do bear that in mind. But yeah, we've now removed this server from the cluster. And if that's all you intend to do, that's it. Now what I've been meaning to do is to rebuild server 1. In other words, to actually take it out of the cluster, replace the boot drive, do a fresh installation of Proxmox VE, just like the actual documentation suggests, and then add it back into the cluster. So I have actually rebuilt it, but I've done this off camera. So this is up to date. It's running 8.24, just like server 2 is. And the reason I've done this off camera is because, well, there's plenty of videos out there that show you how to install Proxmox VE, including one by myself. And there didn't seem any point doing that as part of this video because it would just make the video longer. Having said that, I've also got a video on how to add a server into the cluster, but I'm going to make an exception there because this one's slightly different. This server was originally part of this cluster before. I mean, yes, we've deleted it, but it's got the same name, it's got the same IP address, same MAC address. It's basically identical, albeit it's got a different boot drive. And I want to go through the process in case anything unusual happens. Now, one thing I'll point out is that this server here, server 2, it's got a certificate that my web browser trusts. In other words, it's been provided by a private CA that the browser here trusts. This one here doesn't. It's still running a private certificate. That's deliberate because what I found is that if I give this a trusted certificate, it all gets lost anyway. There's a folder on the server which gets replicated amongst the other servers. And it looks like what's going to happen is this server is just going to effectively overwrite whatever folder this server's got anyway. The reason I say that is because I noticed even the backup files I had just completely disappeared from that folder. So for that reason, I'm not bothering to put the actual certificate on now. I'll do it afterwards. So what I need to do is to add this server to this cluster. To do that, we'll go to data center here, click on cluster, join information, then click copy information. So that'll all get copied to the clipboard. Go to data center, cluster, then we'll click join cluster on this server, paste in the details. It's already filled in all the information it's got. We want to check that, make sure we're going to connect on the right network interface and so on. Otherwise, we'll put in the actual root password for server 2, then click join, then whatever the cluster happens to be called, and then off it'll go. Now, one thing I've found is that sometimes it kind of stalls at that point. You never see this progress any further than, say, that line. If I go over to server 2, on the other hand, you'll see that server is now part of the cluster. If you have a look at the cluster log, what it's been doing, so as far as it's concerned, it's pretty much done. Go back to this one, I'm still waiting. I mean, saying it's okay there. If I go to status, now I've got a connection error. Now, that seems to be common when you're actually connecting to a cluster. So I'm just going to close that tab. I'm going to connect back up to server 1 again. Again, it's warning me it's a private certificate, so as far as I'm concerned, that's fine, at least now anyway. I'll just accept the risk. Now I'll log back into this one, because I want to make sure that I can log into this cluster from either server. So that's one showing itself as up. Server 2 sees both up. So yeah, so it's being able to connect. So that seems fine. So they are connected. So as far as we can tell, things are working, except for this. So this cluster was built, and I added in an SDN network. So this server kind of knows about the SDN network I've built, but it isn't applied. That's what this kind of warning up here is about. It's sitting there saying status pending. So basically what I've got to do is go back to the data center, go back to SDN, and click apply. And then off it'll go, and then it'll configure this server and set it up to support the SDN network. So it takes a bit of a while because it's going to do it on both actual servers. So it's just ticking away there as it makes changes. And that includes like network reload. So it's finished on that one, finished on that one as well. So that's now done. So it's saying available on both actual servers. So that's good to see. So as far as we can tell, things are working. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this server just to be on the safe side, make sure things are still working. So I'm going to move it from server 2 over to server, over to server 1. It shouldn't take too long, but I want to make sure that there's still connectivity going on between the servers as before, and that we haven't broken anything essentially. So I do get that. It seems to be like some sort of cosmetic warning, I think. I've seen that occasionally when it's done as part of a migration, but yeah, it's gone across okay. I mean, we click on the console. I'll just wait for this to connect, and I should see continuous ping requests still going backwards and forwards between this virtual machine and that virtual machine. Now before, as far as I recall, I think the templates were still over there, so I could probably move those back. But as far as I can tell, it is still working. I mean, it's got a connection called VMs that both have that, and they've both got their own local connection. If you go into select storage, I've got an NFS share, so it's connected into the NFS share into a NAS. So that all seems to be working fine. So yeah, seems to work. That clean strategy of just basically wiping the server and starting from scratch seems to be the better way. It is a long, slow process versus maybe cloning it, but at least you can expect it to work. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourselves that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.